I think, again, in his own inadequacy, wanted to shock society and bring attention to himself. I don't see him as an organized offender or a disorganized offender as much as a mixed personality. Charlie Starkweather is different in many respects than most of your serial killers or mass or spree that act in tandem, because of the fact that you're seeing an individual who's being really led by the female, and the female becomes the aggressor and more or less the innovator for the crime. He induced Starkweather to kill her family, wipe out her family, and then induced him to go on the run with her. Both were extremely inadequate, but the real difference here is Starkweather was less intelligent and probably more of what psychologists would call an inadequate personality, suffering from inadequate personality disorder. Carol Fugate, on the other hand, I think was a psychopath, not a sexual psychopath, but a psychopathic personality at a very early age. Eileen Wuornos, although a repetitive killer, is not a serial killer in the sense that she was not a predator who sought out male victims for the reasons that serial killers normally seek out victims, and that usually is very overlying sexual dysfunction. Eileen Wuornos was a prostitute. Her victims were her Johns. Her motivation was a combination of, number one, innate hatred for males, number two, money that she robbed from them during the crimes, and number three, fear of being harmed, hurt, injured, or even killed by a John gone astray. So her killing was very selective. It wasn't she wasn't a predator, and in fact, the only thing that would put her in the ranks of serial killers is sheer numbers and the circumstances of those numbers. My name is Robert K. Ressler. I've retired from the Federal Bureau of Investigation with 20 years of service. I was able to interview 36 violent offenders, in-depth interviews, many of which 15, 16, 18 hours, and amassed a considerable amount of data which led to the publication of the book Sexual Homicide Patterns and Motives. Serial murder, as I see it, and the way I more or less formulated it, is the series of homicides that exceed three, that occur at different times, different places, different events. And in fact, what I find is that usually these crimes are driven by premeditation and planning, and always around a particular fantasy that has usually overridden the thinking patterns of the violent offender, and they've come on very early in life and now drive them to repetitive crimes. And that's basically what these terms serial murder means to me. Jeffrey Dahmer was an individual who told me that he was trying to create sex zombies by drilling holes in the heads of his victims and injecting acid into their brains. He wanted to kill their brains, keep their bodies alive, and thereby he would have a sex zombie at his disposal. And that's a very common attitude on the part of a serial killer, as they want their victims to be objects. They do not want their victims to be a human being. They do not want a sexual partner. They do not want a friend or a person that they can exchange with. They want an object that they can do things to. And the final thing they do to that object is, of course, is death. I personally feel that there is no concept, there is no possibility of rehabilitating a serial killer. Many of them have told me that they have actually planned to do it better next time, to get more satisfaction from the crime, to keep their victim alive longer so that they won't waste this victim. So they actually work at becoming better and better at taking human life and causing human suffering. And a person that has done that, there's just no way of turning that person back to useful society. And in fact, I don't think that we can even afford to experiment along that line. We have to operate in the safe side of society. I think one of the base motivators for a serial killer is a sexual urge that is frustrated from the standpoint that the offender faced with sexual urges has not had the proper upbringing, the proper development from childhood on that gives him the ability to establish consensual relationships with members of the opposite sex or the same sex. It becomes a matter they are so dysfunctional that they cannot interrelate with another human being on a cooperative and consensual basis, and then when the other things impact them, it becomes a matter of forcing themselves on another human being, even at the expense of their life, for the pleasure of that individual. Ritual is a dynamic of human personality that people fall into when in fact they are insecure and they're unsure. When you see a series of crimes where the victim is tied the same way, the victim is gagged the same way, certain things are left at the scene, taken from the scene. Again, it's a person who's insecure in what he is doing and is doing things in this fashion, not consciously, subconsciously, because it gives them a semblance of control. The most important dynamics for a serial killer is control, authority, dominance over their victims, and this is one way of affecting that. I think if competent counseling was made available to some of these young kids that are obviously going off on the wrong path, I think that there might be some ability to change the patterns that will actually start to show themselves in acting out behaviors later on, usually on into adolescence or beyond. And yet most schools, when they hold back on any school programs, oftentimes it's a school counselor that goes first because they can't afford them. In my opinion, I don't think you cannot afford not to have them. It's a very simplistic breakout, but basically it is a replacement, a substitution for talking in the more psychiatric model of what we would call an antisocial personality disorder. A psychopath is what we would call the organized, a psychotic, and various forms of psychosis, manic depressives, schizophrenics, you name it, all these various complicated mental disorders which police officers may not be familiar with, so we'll merely say disorganized. The mixed would show dynamics of both organized and disorganized in different weights. Again, we don't want to get into deep psychological terminology with law enforcement officers who may not have had the benefit of training in those areas. We found that oftentimes these individuals were from dysfunctional families, dysfunctional homes. There was some sort of a emotional crisis. There was bedwetting on into their adolescence. There was fire setting, arson, pyromania, cruelty to animals. You name it. There were these things that seemed to be common threads, but the motivational factor, the actual kickoff, always it seemed to be a basis of bizarre fantasy above and beyond that of normal thinking. I think that this concept comes from the old horror tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde idea. That notion of two personalities in one has been carried over to the MPD condition. And in reality, most mental health practitioners will tell you that there are very few, if any, real documented cases of multiple personality disorder as being a basis for a person who is a serial killer. Back in the mid-70s, when studying the problems at hand of violent offenders, I found one thing that was really lacking was a lexicon of terminology that would be appropriate to the study of violent offenders. The British were using the term series crimes for a series of repetitious, say, burglaries, property crimes, sexual assaults, series. So with the series crimes from England and serial from the American movie scene, I figured that serial murder would be a good term to lay to the repetitious and multiple violent offender. When you see an individual in class that is disruptive, that is seeking the attention of the class through negative means, fighting, assaults on other students, destruction of school property, destruction of his own property, injuring other students. Now, when you see really violent and destructive and harmful acts on a consistent basis, and that desire for undue attention, I think these are very clear signs of problems. If a police officer, say in Seattle, Washington, had a missing or a murdered individual, he would fill out that VICAP form, 187 different questions, 15 pages of information, and it would be submitted to the FBI Academy at Quantico, Virginia, where it would be put into a computer. The computer, through programming would isolate information and dynamics of that Seattle murder against all crimes in the database that had been previously entered, and in fact it would come out with 10 of the top closest matches to that Seattle homicide that is available in that system. And of course the idea is that through this system you may find one individual that has committed many crimes, and he may be caught and brought to justice for those crimes. I don't think there's any question that violence in the media, the entertainment media in particular, and the news media as well, becomes a stimulation for a violent offender. Keep in mind that your serial killer in particular, and your violent offender as well, of all sorts, are individuals who are dysfunctional human beings. They have, since very, very early in their life, have tuned onto and tuned into the wrong cues in society that normal people do not focus on. Sex is one concept, violence is another, but now we have, on into the 80s and 90s, we have a concept of sexual violence, which becomes a theme of many, many motion pictures and books. So what we see here is the softcore pornography, or the hardcore pornography, is really not a stimulus, but it's a sexually violent material, and there's plenty of it that will stimulate these people sometimes to acting out against a human being. The common notion that people just snap, that there's a snap and a person goes off into this violent behavior, is just not a reality. This is something that's a lifelong circumstance. Even the mass murders, it is not something that just happens overnight, although the mass murders oftentimes will snap with a history of developmental problems. But the serial murder is an individual who has very bizarre fantasies, who starts acting out on those fantasies very early in life, preteen, pre-adolescent, adolescent. And it becomes an evolutional type thing that over a period of years, the snowball's getting bigger and bigger.
My name is Robert Roy Hazelwood. I go by the name of Roy. I served 22 years in the FBI, the last 17 of which was with the Behavioral Science Unit at the FBI Academy. We had 3 primary tasks in the Behavioral Science Unit. That was to conduct research into violent crime, serial murderers, serial rapists, child abductors, stranger-to-stranger serial crimes. Our second task was to consult on ongoing crimes of violence and to testify as expert witnesses. And our third task was to disseminate what we had learned through training and educational endeavors. Fantasy plays a very large role. It's one of the reasons law enforcement has so much difficulty in identifying and apprehending the proficient, organized serial killer. And that is because they've devoted so much of their lives to the planning, to the thinking, to the fantasizing, if you will, about the crime. But that by the time they act out, it's as though they've been doing it for years. The FBI has maintained that there is approximately 36 serial killers operating at any given time. I know of no reason to change that estimate. You may arrest an individual 7 years after he's begun killing. He may only tell you of 2 or 3 that he's killed, or he may tell you of 27 that he's killed. That's not to say he's told you of all of them. Some of those may not be identified. So there's really absolutely no way to accurately estimate how many deceased are the victims of serial killers in any given year. But yes, I do believe that there are certain individuals that committed crimes that they were not competent to make a decision whether it was right or wrong, and they committed those crimes. Those individuals should be protected with the insanity defense. But I believe it's abused much more frequently than it's legitimately used. When you use the topic serial murder, that's one of 3 categories of multiple murderers. Serial murder is an individual who kills, a period of time goes by, his emotions have cooled off, and he kills a second time. A period of time goes by and he kills a third time. He may go on to kill many, many more. That's differentiated from a spree killer. That's an individual who kills someone during the commission of a crime. He goes on, kills another person, say on his way home. He's stopped by a police officer because of a faulty taillight. He kills the police officer. He gets home, he kills his wife and family and barricades himself in the residence. So he's killed a series of people, but it's all connected to a single incident. The third type of multiple murderer is your mass murderer, an individual who kills 4 or more people at one location at one time. Serial murder is not a new phenomenon. It's been around since the history of man, to the best of my knowledge. For example, they might find someone who was a victim of a lust murder. She'd been eviscerated, or her throat had been cut and her breast removed, for example. The vaginal area attacked in a particularly gruesome way, and bite marks on the neck or the breast or the abdomen. And then they would find human footprints. And they would say, surely it can't be a human being. It must be half animal, half man. Therefore, I think that's how the legend of the werewolf began.